I've grown 5 inches. Miigwech, Maltiosh, and thank you everybody for your patience, and let's move forward because that's what we do when we're working towards reconciliation. Again, I'd like to acknowledge my ancestors, but also the peoples of these lands who have welcomed me in friendship and kinship. As Indigenous peoples, that's what we do. As I was saying, I'm Maya Achi. I was born under the guidance of our guide, Noh. I use my intellect and my heart for the good of creation. I am a daughter, a mother, an auntie, a partner. And being on this territory, I'd like to say that has been very eye-opening. So let's back up, and here we are. That is a picture of Whitefish Island. And the reason why I'm showing that to acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe and the Métis peoples of these territories, and on the territory of the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, is because the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is what I will focus on as part of my presentation, is the fact that we lie at the crossroads of many waterways. We're a port city. We also sit along the Trans-Canada Highway, along the rail lines, and these are not just transport routes, they're also trafficking routes, and we need to pay attention to that. I'd also like to recognize the Métis Nation of Ontario and other peoples that have come here to this gathering place, like the Misnabi Cree. As a faculty member at Algoma University, an institution of higher learning with a special mission to advance Chief Shiwakonse's vision of a teaching wigwam, it is important that my work has meaning to community, and this is why I'm here. I'm here because I sit on the shoulders of the work that has been done by community. I have been asked to present the work that we do together. This work has meaning to community, and it opens spaces to talk about uncomfortable issues. As we have witnessed throughout this event, we cannot live side by side in peace without knowing the truth. This truth leads us to understand who we are, where we have been, so we can work towards actions that will ensure our words and actions promote the well-being for all. And in this spirit, I must acknowledge that all the contributions and the presentation is made possible by the guidance of elders, past and present, Indigenous peoples, activists, leaders, and thinkers that have led the way for resistance to the violence inflicted against Indigenous peoples since contact. But I also take something very special away from all of these teachings, and that is the resilience and the resistance that we show as a people. We're still here. We're still here. I believe everybody knows what we need to do intellectually, but today I'm asking you to also open your hearts, connect what's on your minds to your hearts so that we can do the right things. I'm going to talk about relationality in Indigenous-Ally collaborations, and I will first begin by what I mean by relationality and its role in teaching and research in academia. I will talk to you about a research that I am involved with Indigenous Anishinaabe women here in Baawaating, but also in Mexico. In doing so, I will relate to you the beginnings of the anti-violence task force. It's the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force of Baawaating. I must say also that I do not represent all the interests or points of view within the Baawaating area, nor Mexico, but it is informed by what communities are saying. On this slide, I'm showing you a stele, which is a record of our knowledge. This one is found in Chiapas, Mexico, where my partner is from, and it's the Tree of Life. The tree of life is a metaphor and a guiding concept that leads nations and communities and people to understand how we're connected to one another. So the concept of living in relation with the physical and spiritual realm is part of our way of understanding and being in this world. The saying, all our relations, which we hear often, emphasizes that we're all related in a web of connections that could not exist without everybody doing their part. The notion that we're part of a bigger whole that we're accountable to speaks to what Margaret Kovach describes as a web of interconnection that creates knowledge and the way peoples, places, and language connect to create a way of being in the world. We know that to be connected is to be whole. And of course, in understanding that we belong to something larger than ourselves, we must also remember that we have relational accountability, as Cree scholar Sean Wilson says. Who do we respond to? Who are we accountable to? In my own Maya culture, we have a term called the Hun Winak. My good friend and older brother and Maya Quiche elder, Jose Yaknoch, explained to me that this concept describes the process of becoming whole again. Becoming whole, as I understand it, means bringing one's physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual parts together. Colonization intended to dismember all of these parts, but healing and hope intends to remember, regather, and heal this. Becoming whole again is a process, and it requires that we care for oneself before we take care of others. So in a nutshell, becoming whole requires constant work, perseverance, patience, acceptance, and a willingness to engage in concrete actions to make ourselves well again. I remember this teaching daily, and this is the teaching that I would like allies to walk away with. We need to connect our heart and our mind. My hope is that this practice will allow others to connect with their own teachings of being well. So for Indigenous peoples in general, and I will use the UN definition to bring us all together, we have a politics of resistance and possibilities that brings us together in spite of constant attempts of destroying our cultures and nations through colonization and imperialism. Indigenous worldviews and teachings help to assert our own power and thus turn victimhood upside down. We are not victims, we are survivors. Victimhood stalls us, but hope moves us forward. So this brings me to the role of relationality in higher education. As you can see in this slide, this is a snapshot of one of the woven textiles that we wear in Guatemala. And it has the description of the tree of life in the middle and the 4 original peoples at the bottom and at the top, connecting the spirits to the earth beings. Again, as an Indigenous Maya scholar in higher education, I have many responsibilities, including being accountable to our own nations, but also the communities in which we live and work. In fact, we're accountable to all of creation. Now, what I do here is teaching and research mostly, and I cannot divorce one from the other. We know that this institution, as a former residential school, perpetuated and perpetrated violence against Indigenous people, against Anishinaabe children, and the effects are still being felt today, as many of our presenters have already stated. So it makes it even more imperative to work for our communities, to prevent these wrongdoings from happening again. We're here to make visible the histories, voices, and perspectives that are not often heard. I have many students that come here saying, I never knew. I've lived here all my life. How could I not know? But it is true also that teaching this is a hard task. We need to learn to listen and to listen with our hearts. When we listen with our hearts, we come to understand that we have many responsibilities in guiding current and future generations of professionals that need the knowledge to engage with Indigenous peoples in a respectful manner. And this is, of course, the teaching of the circle of life. And this is done by artist Zoe Wood-Solomon, whose art is at the back. And this is a beautiful rendition of the circle of life. Again, I want to say that the topics that I teach here at Algoma University, like many of my Indigenous colleagues and allies, center Indigenous bodies of knowledge so that students become aware of the stories that mainstream education failed to teach. As professors, we teach people to unlearn the hurtful ways in which Indigenous peoples have been constructed through negative stereotypes. We have heard a lot about how we need to unlearn. I'm going to re-emphasize the need to do that. As Indigenous peoples, we are constantly given the message that we're not capable of conducting our own affairs, that our knowledge is not valid, that it's outdated, that it's a myth. We hear it today. Recently, political hopefuls debated whether Indigenous peoples can actually have decision-making powers in stopping projects that harm Indigenous peoples. Free, prior, and informed consent was discussed. It's not consulting, it's telling people and trying to get them to say yes to development projects that they don't want. This is not reconciliation. We also heard the current federal debate that just happened, and 20 minutes were assigned to Indigenous issues. There was no mention on the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited LGBTQIA folks. There was no discussion about the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There was no mention of how to implement the TRC, 92 recommendations. In fact, all in all, there were 8 minutes dedicated to Indigenous issues. There was no mention of treaties. And of course, no debate or a question even about the federal government's challenge to the ruling by the Human Rights Tribunal demanding that the government pay maximum compensation to First Nations children harmed by the on-reserve welfare system since 2006. That is preposterous. So again, although we are diverse, most Indigenous cultures hold some collective values of the land is sacred, water is life and important to survival, and anything that threatens these might not be the best choice for the future. So why are we being told that we are not as valuable as European cultures and peoples? Why is the sacredness of land, of women, of water, of life overshadowed by the need to consume and keep our current economy going? Why can't we develop alternative economies? We're using just what we need, going on that teaching that we take what we need and we give back. Why is that not our priority? Here at Algoma University, my classes are informed by the work that I've been doing, by who I am, and the work of Indigenous peoples working towards self-determination. We have had many, many reports since time immemorial that talk about the need for governments to change. We have the red paper challenging the white paper. We have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the Aboriginal Healing Foundation, Sisters in Spirit. We have the final MMIWG 2S LGBTQIA+ report. In spite of these reports, however, and constitutional reforms, we continue to witness the lack of access to justice and rights for Indigenous peoples. We also continue to witness how derogatory comments and stereotypes of Indigenous peoples inform policies and everyday acts of aggression. So it's systemic and it's individual. We need to change both. My research speaks to the justice calls made by the final report on the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited LGBTQIA folks. We know that there's a lot of social exclusion that has led women into poverty, human trafficking, and going missing or dying at the hands of individuals that do not value their lives, nor respect anything that has to do with Indigenous peoples. This is a genocide. It is not in the past, it happens today. It happens when we fail to call attention to stereotypes, to not teach or to undo the learnings that we often hear in the media or in books. My work really hopes to change things because I'm a mother, a sister, and an auntie. And as Nevaeh Pine said, we need to look for our girls. We need to make sure they don't go missing. As Ted Nolan graciously said yesterday, if our children are not well, we're not well. And many children are not well. More children are in the system today than there were in residential schools. Women in Baawaating know this and have been organizing for a long time to raise awareness on the issue, and more recently, for 11 years here in Sault Ste. Marie, on the March to remember missing and murdered Indigenous women. So this is a picture of the courthouse with the ribbons that we put every year prior to the march. And I have participated in this since 2014. But I also started doing this because my students led the way. They organized a vigil in March of 2014 after Tina Fontaine, 14-year-old girl from Sakijing First Nation, was murdered while in foster care. Let's remember that her accused murderer was acquitted in 2018, and there have been no more calls for justice. These very violent acts triggered my memory of the work I'd done during my doctoral research in Guatemala and Mexico, as well as the historical memory of how Indigenous women have been targets of colonial wars. We are targets of rape and torture. These are military tactics that are used during the Civil War and today. So I tried to facilitate, create spaces for students to talk about these issues. And so it is a tremendous honor when my students lead these initiatives. So eventually, I was asked to participate in what is now called the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force of Baawaating, which is a grassroots initiative that resonates with my own experiences as a Maya Indigenous woman. I'll now go into what it is, because this is an example of how universities can promote community-based, collaborative, Indigenous research that actually has meaning to community. And I want to first also thank my colleagues who are still here, the Indigenous women of the Anti-Violence Task Force, Eva Debuch, Betty Anjikuneb back there, and Taylor Jolin. Thank you for staying through this. So what do I mean by gendered and colonial violence? Well, it means that women are targeted by violence because of their gender and for being Indigenous. So let me explain. The imposition of non-Indigenous ways and institutions led to the exploitation of Indigenous lands and resources. And this not only happened on their lands, but also bodies, communities, and families. It broke the respect for women's traditional roles in what Brenda Childs, whose Red Lake Anishinaabe calls holding our world together. Our world became undone in a way. We have also Erin Walsky, who's a Chapleau Cree First Nation woman who worked for the Native Women's Association of Canada on the Sisters in Spirit campaign, and she says, prior to First Contact, many Indigenous societies were matriarchal in nature and focused on family, community, and the continuity of tradition, culture, and language. Indigenous women were central to all of this as teachers, healers, givers of life. While Indigenous men and women had distinct roles, their roles were equally valued. And I think we forget that sometimes. So violence against Indigenous women and also two-spirited or non-binary identified gender folks shows connections between capitalism, racism, and colonialism. We know that Anishinaabe women's roles were undermined by patriarchy, and although patrilineal, their roles were valued and women esteemed. We performed an indispensable role in passing on cultural values and attitudes about labor across generations. Elderly women also were granted considerable power and authority in their society, says Brenda Childs. But today, the continuation of this dislocation are evident in the dehumanizing treatment of Indigenous women in the media and the general attitudes of settler society. It is clear that patriarchy is an expression of colonialism's intent to do away with the backbone of Indigenous nations. Indigenous women continue to hold nations together, lead the way in demanding improvements in health, poverty, hunger, and the need to keep a family together despite years of systemic legal erasure through the Indian Act, residential schools, the 60s scoop, the displacement and degradation of land and territory. And of course, this has been documented in general, but not anything very specific about the Baawaating area. There's a resurgence and birth of a task force that does this work in this area. We were created as a particular place to address the persistent issue of violence towards Indigenous communities, and especially violence directed towards self-identified Indigenous women and girls. I have to say that I'm proud to belong to this organization. I'm proud that they claim me. It is a grassroots community-based, 100% Indigenous-led organization comprised of various local organizations. We have organizations like Nimki, Wawagan Family Shelter, Indian Friendship Center. We have the Métis Nation of Ontario working with us, MMIWG, North Shore Council, and we're hoping that we will continue to do this work together to conduct research that matters. As you can see in this slide, we've done a lot of work. Whatever I'm saying and whatever we have documented, our strategic plan, our vision, mission is actually informed by community. Nothing goes by without being vetted by community and discussed by community. This process began in 2018 after having spent years organizing the annual Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's March, as I said. And the question began, what are we gonna do, as Nevaeh Pine said? Are we gonna do more than just one event a year? And so we have reached out to allies like the mayor's office, other programs that deal with victim services and women being trafficked, and also our local First Nations leadership for support. This work has provided the work exposure and opportunities to engage the community on providing culturally grounded solutions to the issue. And of course, our ultimate goal is to end all forms of violence and work as a volunteer organization to advocate to restore the honor of self-identified Indigenous women and girls. So based on all of this work, it's a long story to say that community is interested in documenting its own knowledge of gendered and colonial violence in the area. This is something, again, that is non-existent. We have reports about human trafficking, but not about the whole problematic of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the area. As I said before, Sault Ste. Marie rests in the heart of Northern Ontario along Trans-Canada Highway 17, with this major route into and out of our city. Indigenous peoples make up 11% of Sault Ste. Marie's population, and our girls and women often travel this highway. We know that there's issues with getting to and from Garden River First Nation. We have a lot of students that sometimes can't come to Algoma because there is no transportation. There simply isn't. So we need to look at that. We also know that we are nestled right by the St. Mary's River, major shipping route, and we don't have any specific data, but we have heard a lot of stories that women are shipped in the cargo and they're used as chattel and they're used for sexual pleasure. We have another report that was produced in Duluth, Minnesota, but we have nothing of the sort here in Baawaating. This report is called The Garden of Truth, and it was published in 2011. This is a strategic plan that we developed over a 1-year period. We also have other reports like Red Women Rising in Vancouver's downtown east side that shows how Indigenous women and girls go missing at a rate of 12 times more than non-Indigenous women and girls. Again, we know that the issue is really pressing here in Sault Ste. Marie, so we need a way to document all that is known in this area. So what we really want to do is to compile information, create holistic prevention programs, foster spaces for healing, and share knowledge of services that are supposed to protect self-identified women and girls from the dehumanization that happens. Likewise, we've been working with women in Mexico. There's a group called the National Coordinator for Indigenous Women in Mexico, and they've been around since 1997. They have highlighted that this issue is really important in Mexico because there are no statistics. Everything is lumped into the category woman, and this is problematic. So for those who do research, you know that you have to really desegregate the data, the information, so that you can point the unique characteristics of the problematic. So the Committee Against Discrimination and Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women reported in 2018 that in Mexico, 9 women are murdered daily. 9 women. This prompted the CONAMI, the organization we are hoping to work with more closely, to start collecting their own data. And so they developed their own methodology to identify whether an Indigenous woman who has been reported missing or who has a clip in the media about their death, to see whether they are Indigenous or not. And so far, they have documented a lot of cases, and they want to continue this work. Again, we need to reach the communities, ask them what they need, or if they come to you, you need to provide the supports that they need. This is the work that we're trying to do and build at a national, regional, and international level. So I'm going to fast forward and tell you how we're bringing it all together here in Baawaating in Mexico. So working with both organizations, I am reminded of the importance of listening and responding to the call to do this work where lives and livelihoods are at stake. We're not doing this for research's sake. We're not doing it to get grant money. We're not doing it to get prestige. This goes beyond our individual selves. It is for the well-being of our communities. Women's lives are at stake. So this project, again, will document the information that already exists within the 2 organizations, and it will call upon ally researchers to help make sense of this information according to how the community interprets the information and sees fit. Again, this work is really important because we have very little or no information at present to explore and compare these areas and to also promote knowledge exchanges so that people can actually engage with people that have been there and done that. This work didn't just start overnight. It's been happening since 2016 when we held a virtual forum on violence against Indigenous women in the Americas. And finally, we connected to this new Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force in 2017. So we also were lucky enough to have 7 women come up through a SSHRC-funded project. They came to Algoma University at the end of April. And we had 3 days of intense conversations and community events where we actually shared what we were doing, got to know each other. They got to take a tour of the residential school at Algoma, and it made a huge impact because their perception of Indigenous women here in the North was completely different. They thought Indigenous women here were okay. They thought because of the resources that Canada has and the richness of the land that we would be okay, but it's not the truth. So during this event, we identified 3 overlapping thematic areas that we both want to work on. The first one is the role of colonization in institutional relationships with Indigenous communities, something we've been talking a lot about here. Also the need to reclaim, relearn, and revitalize traditional forms of governance, particularly around justice and healing, and working collaboratively with allies for violence prevention and to achieve truth and reconciliation. For this particular section, we have identified the role that culture plays in violence prevention. Now, when I say culture, it's really, really tricky because we have to really be critical of what the actual values and teachings are and how we're actually applying them or not in our daily lives. It's a very, very delicate subject. But if we design this together, which we are, and operationalize it from this Indigenous community-based, multi-pronged, multi-scalar, multilingual, and transnational research approach, where we have constant communication and vetting of what we're doing, and an understanding that things could change, and an acceptance that at any time, any of the communities, any people involved will actually say, we don't want to do this anymore, and we have to respect that, right? So we need to remember those things. So again, I'm going to fast forward and show you some more pictures here. This is the collective. We also had academics from British Columbia, University of Calgary, and the Institut National de Recherche Scientifique. So we mapped the violences. This is one of the maps that we did. We also mapped in one of the gatherings hosted here by the Indigenous Women's Anti-Violence Task Force through Ms. Navi Cree and through a grant by the federal government, a map that you have here on the table on the left, and I welcome you to come and see it. We actually asked the impact of this issue on families here in the Baawaating area, and you will see that there are red dresses there that actually tell us of how many people this issue has impacted in the area, and this is just the beginning of what we could be doing. We've also worked with TwoSpirit People, and we had the honor of having Teddy Surrett speak at our gathering because, let's face it, self-identified women includes trans women and two-spirited people, and we need to hear more about that. And I'd like to end by saying that we as professors and we at this institution can build institutional bridges to advance the work that has already happened in communities. I am merely a facilitator of dialogues who provide the role of an outsider and insider, someone that can lead, but also lead by following the decisions of community and support through the resources that I can get through institutional outlets. We have to also make some recommendations to say that community engaged work takes time and it takes resources, and that needs to be accounted for within the adjudication process, but also it has to be accounted for within our work as academics, and it needs to be well advised. So I'd like to end by saying, let's do this work for reconciliation because we don't want any more stolen sisters. Ni una más. Miigwech.